Hello, this video is designed for higher level history students, those of you studying Africa and the Middle East for paper 3. If you're studying the Middle East after 1945, you'll be doing Iran as a case study, and this is to help you out with the bullet point regarding Iran since 1945, having a look in particular at the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and the Islamic Republic of Iran founded in 1979 and of course still going to this day, although the course stops in the year 2000. This quote here by Robin Wright from his 2002 article, and I think it's really important to understand that it establishes a precedent that is Iranian first as it spreads out across the Muslim world, this idea that Islam is a way of actually modernizing, of making changes, and perhaps despite Western portrayals of the sort of the revolution kind of sending Iran back in time, the kind of upheavals that happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s actually kind of demonstrated that Islam can actually be a modern idiom as well. It could be something that's modern. That's what Robin Wright is talking about in that particular article. Remember that the Shah's repression had been particularly successful in the 60s and 70s, and really by the late 1970s the Shia clergy, the ulama, were really the only organised group available for many people. There are small communist parties, the Tudeh for example, and there are other groups as well that are dissatisfied with the Shah, but perhaps the Shia ulama have the widest reach. One of the things that you need to think about is how then the revolution is portrayed, and those of you writing for paper 3 are always interested in that concept of perspective and points of view about how things can be portrayed regarding the past. So have a think. I mean, we often talk about an Islamic revolution, but there's really lots of different ways that you can describe what happens in Iran in 1979. And these little tables here, you could sort of mix and match up your interpretation according to the reading and the evidence that you're finding. And there's plenty of historians out there that have a variety of different opinions about what caused the revolution. So have a think about what kind of angles and perspectives you might like to take, and then find some supporting evidence for that. Remember, of course, that Iran is unique in that it's a Shia majority country with now a Shia government. Although there are large Shia populations in other countries across the Middle East, remember Shia itself as the branch of Islam is not the majority group. So two of the things that you can really begin to think about as you plan and think about how you would write an exam essay for this topic are these two kind of key questions. Is why are the Iranians unable to export their revolution? It doesn't go anywhere else, but at the same time, how does it have influence? I mean, first of all, you need to really think about that first question. Iran is quite unique. It's an overwhelmingly Shiite country in a bloc that's probably 80–90% Sunni Muslim. Ethnically, it stands alone. Linguistically, it stands alone. So it perhaps just doesn't have the reach that Ayatollah Khomeini perhaps hoped when the revolution happens in 1979. It does have a huge influence though, and really, even though most of the other countries around us are Sunni Muslims and have Sunni majorities, it still kind of lights a fire in the Muslim world, and it's a trend that begins to kind of link to radicalism. There's plots to overthrow the government of Bahrain, there's influences in Sudan, the assassination of Anwar Sadat happens in 1981, so there certainly is this kind of growing momentum in Islamic movements. But also I think there's probably something else to have a look at that Robin Wright also puts out, is that there's also these Islamic alternatives to failed state institutions. You might have already thought about this looking at Egypt and the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in state welfare, but schools, clinics, farm cooperatives, welfare agencies, all of these types of things are coming from Islamic groups now as the central state is failing, it's way down in bureaucracy and corruption, and there's networks of religious associations for workers, teachers, doctors and professionals and so on. So in that kind of sense now, Islam is really being woven into the fabric of the daily life. And I think this is an important element that Ayatollah Khomeini kind of also puts forward, that you have to be more than a thinker. You have to kind of do it and carry out the practice as well. So why not take a moment and pause the video and have a think back on your studies so far and think about what were the causal factors for the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And there's sort of 4 big categories that you could have a think about. So press pause now and see what you can remember about the long-term and short-term causes of the revolution in 1979. So you might have thought about political causes, you might have had to think about the repression of the Shah, you might have gone back to the 1953 coup, you definitely should have thought about the secret police and the restriction on political parties and the lack of participation in the Iranian political system. Economically, although there's abundant wealth and you've got good evidence from that with the sort of Shah's extravagance, those big parties and the high spending projects, but remember, for many Iranian people, particularly the rural poor, that wealth just doesn't simply trickle down. Socially, there's been massive urbanization at this time, bringing people together from the countryside into big new towns and cities. Perhaps the promise, that urban dream, doesn't always become to reality, so there's perhaps some disillusionment there in social terms. Cultural and religious terms, as I mentioned earlier, it's the Shia ulama who are the kind of surviving group of the Shah's repression. And many people who are rejecting that kind of West toxification of the Shah will begin to show their protests against the Shah by having a more outward expression of religion. So there's lots of things to think about. So make sure you're clear on the disappointments of the White Revolution. Make sure you're clear on the way that ordinary Iranians challenge the Shah's legitimacy and rule. A key part of the 1979 revolution is the role of Ayatollah Khomeini, who will become the supreme leader of Iran after the revolution. You should need to understand how important the role of the Ayatollah is in Shia Islam and the respect that he would have as a religious scholar of integrity. He's been a voice against the Shah for a number of years. He's exiled in 1963. He spends his time mostly in Iraq, where he is also carefully controlled by the Iraqi authorities. They're not too keen to have a high-profile Shia cleric also stirring up trouble given the Shia majority population in Iraq. But in 1988, he actually moves to France, and it's at that point that without the kind of control of the Iraqis, that the Ayatollahs, it's easy for Ayatollah supporters to get messages back to Iran. They're usually recorded on tape cassettes and then passed around in Iran. And the philosophy and ideology of the Ayatollah is heavily influenced by one of his teachers, Ali Shariati, who is this idea that the clergy should play a leadership role in guiding society because they best understand the Islamic value systems, and that really your way to advance was to reach your highest potential within Islamic values. But also another element of the Ayatollah's philosophy is that you should do it, you should be it, you should live it. To study it is just simply part of the element, but you should also kind of carry it out in a more active way. So you should live the life that you preach. If you have a look, there's a little link there to a YouTube video with an interview with the Ayatollah just after the revolution in 1979. Again, there's a useful news clip here that will take you through the events of 1979, and you can see the high levels of mass participation and support there for the Ayatollah and his return to Iran in 1979. So press pause now and go to another screen and watch that video. It will take you about 5 or 6 minutes. So 1979 is a pretty busy year in Iran. There's lots of activity, and that news clip should hopefully take you through all of those things. The Rex Cinema in Abadan is burned. That's a key area. Savak was initially blamed, but the blame is later shifted to Islamic militants. The Shah has declared martial law. There's a huge number of protests with people being shot at and killed. And Ashura demonstrations, the Muharram protests of 1978, excuse me, are these massive anti-Shah demonstrations. So one of the things that we really can think about, and we often talk about the revolution of 1979 as an Islamic revolution, but there are definitely other elements that are involved. It isn't really clear, and Luciano Zaccara of Qatar University pointed this out, it isn't really clear what Khomeini's kind of perhaps more worldly objectives are for Iran. While he's in Iraq and France, he's also meeting with Marxists. And some of the more secular supporters of Khomeini thought that there would be perhaps a counterbalance to clerical groups. So there isn't necessarily a clear kind of ideology or a clear framework for how Ayatollah Khomeini kind of plans to run Iran once he comes into power. In terms of who's involved, you've still got key numbers of politicians. The National Front, Barzani, who's the Prime Minister of Iran for part of this time, he is also involved. The Tudeh, the Marxists, who are anti-Shah and anti-American, they're also involved. You've got Islamist guerrillas, and you've also got anti-Islamist terrorists as well, the Mujahideen, who are left-wing guerrillas. And I think as the revolution begins to kind of get momentum, as the Shah is removed, as I said earlier, the Shia clergy, in particular Ayatollah Khamenei, is the group around which kind of everything seems to be centralizing. And with the removal of the Shah, they kind of begin to sort of fade away. Of course, the Ayatollah himself would never accept atheists and communists as partners, but certainly people are angry with the Shah. Certainly they're concerned about feeding their children, they're concerned about food supplies, they're concerned about wealth distribution. So in terms of the revolution itself, you can make some strong cases for alternatives, that it isn't, that it has a variety of different causal factors. And again, IB students, that will help you add perspectives. So a question from May 1914 asks you about the longer term causes of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and specifically mentions the White Revolution. So you should be able to organise the causes of the revolution according to long-term and short-term causes, and you should be able to organise it thematically, politically, socially, economic, and then of course cultural and religious. So make sure that you're clear on those causes. This will be there'll be a second part of the video coming up in a minute.